The night is as bright as ink, and the palace of the sky is particularly magnificent under the moonlight. Between the palaces of carved beams and paintings, occasionally there are patrol servants talking in a low voice, and their feet are reverberating on the blue stone slabs. Pei Ling was dressed in a plain-colored palace girl's dress, lowering her head, holding a dim yellow palace light in her hand, and walked through the long corridor lightly, like the most inconspicuous fog in this imperial palace. But her eyes were as sharp as a keel, sweeping over every corner and recording every strange face. On the surface, she was a low-class palace girl who had just entered the palace, but in fact, she was one of the top assassins in the Shadow Blade of the Dark Wave group. There was only one mission to sneak into the imperial palace, collect information, protect family secrets, and then investigate the whereabouts of his brother who had been separated for many years. "Hey, Pei Ling, go slower, wait for me." A girl with a round face caught up with her panting, holding a bunch of just-washed clothes in her hands, and her face was filled with complaints. "Why are you walking faster than a rabbit this time? We are just going to the imperial garden to deliver things, so what are you anxious about?" Pei Ling smiled slightly and said in a low voice, "Sister Xiaoya, our palace ladies are not worth the money. If they are too late, they will be beaten." Her voice was gentle, carrying a difficult-to-observe separation. Xiao Yu curled her lips and muttered, "It's just a slight slap. I'm all habitual. Why are you not afraid of this new arrival? Yesterday I heard that a nanny accidentally hit a treasurer and was dragged off the cane. Now I'm still lying down and can't get up." Pei Ling lowered her head and sneered at the corner of her mouth. Afraid? She grew up in the Shadow Blade and licked blood on the tip of the knife for more than 10 years. What is this little wind in the imperial palace? However, she still put on a timid look and said lightly, "Sister Xiaoya said, I remember." The two of them spoke and had arrived near the imperial garden. The night wind is slightly cool, carrying the fragrance of flowers and plants, and it also contains an inexplicable atmosphere of killing. Pei Ling's ears twitched slightly, and she heard the slight sound of footsteps that were not far away, as well as the light sound of metallic sensation, that was the sound of weapons colliding. Her heart was tightened, and she didn't feel vocal on her face. She stopped walking and said to Xiaoya with a low voice, "Sister Xiaoya, I suddenly feel uncomfortable. Can you please send something first? I'll go back." Xiao Yu was stunned and said in a bad mood, "Why is your stomach sore at this time?" "Okay, go ahead and don't let me get mad." Pei Ling clicked her head and turned around and walked towards the path beside her. As soon as Yu's figure disappeared, a cold light flashed in her eyes, and her body swept towards the sound like a ghost. Deep in the imperial garden, behind a rockery, several black shadows were surrounding a woman in Chinese, with a sword-like shadow, killing her intimidatingly. The woman was dressed in a moon-white palace dress and wearing a gold horn on her head. Her appearance was absolutely beautiful and she was shocked. She stepped back step by step without any iron, and her voice trembled. "Who are you?" "This palace is the precious concubine Yulan. Whoever dares to touch me will definitely honor you 9 clans." The man in black in the head sneered, and Sha Shao said in a voice, "Empress Nu, you have no fault of your fate today, no wonder we are. Brothers, come on." The sword flashed, and the jade lapel was about to fade away, and Pei Ling's figure burst out like a black wind. She flipped her wrist and pulled out a short dagger from her sleeve. The cold light flashed and directly pierced the throat of the man in black who was closest to Jade Lawn. The blood was sprayed, and the man fell to the ground without even having time to make a scream. "Who is it?" The other assassins were shocked, turned around, and the sword pointed directly at Pei Ling. Pei Ling smiled coldly and said in a low voice, "If you want someone to die, you have to ask whether the knife in my hand will answer." Her body was like electricity, and the dagger danced in her hand, and every hit was directly at the critical point. Although these assassins were well trained, they were as unbearable as earthen chickens and tiles in front of Pei Ling. But in a moment, 5 or 6 corpses were lying on the ground, and bloody air spread in the night wind. The last assassin saw something wrong, so he turned around and ran away. Pei Ling snorted coldly, bent her fingers and a hidden weapon shot straight out, hitting the man's heart. The other party hummed, fell to the ground, and then snored. Yulan stood there in a daze, her face turned pale, and there was a complex light in her eyes. She looked at Pei Ling and said in a low voice, "Who are you? Why should you save me?" Pei Ling put away the dagger, lowered her head and knelt down respectfully, and said with a gentle voice, "Grandmaster, the youngest is the girl in the middle of the palace, named Pei Ling. When she passed by this place, she saw the queen encountering her, and then she came to rescue her in a hurry. The youngest martial arts are rough, but fortunately she didn't hurt her." Yulan looked at her, her eyes filled with review. After a moment, she smiled lightly, her voice softened a little. "Rough martial arts? I see that you are extraordinary. How can you look like an ordinary palace girl? Let's get up. If it weren't for you today, I might have been ordered here." Pei Ling stood up, lowered her head, still looking down on her face, and was secretly alert in her heart. This precious concubine is indeed as in the news, with a delicate mind and a simple character. Yulan walked a few steps closer, lifted Pei Ling's chin and carefully looked at her face. Her fingers were icy, carrying an inexplicable gentleness. Pei Ling's heart thumped and she didn't dare to move. "You have such beautiful eyes, and you have many secrets, right?" Yulan said softly, with a touch of fun in her language. Pei Ling felt nervous, and pretended to be ignorant, and replied lightly, "The Empress was laughing. She was just an ordinary palace girl. How could she have any secrets? She just learned some self-defense from a young age with the keys in the village. Today, she helped the Empress." Yulan smiled and didn't ask any more, but just said lightly, "No matter if you have no secrets, you saved this palace today, and I have recorded it. Come." As she finished speaking, several servants rushed over, and they obviously heard the sound of fighting. Yulan pointed to the bodies on the ground and said coldly, "Take the heads of these assassins cleanly and find out who was sent by them. Also, from today on Pei Ling will be placed at our palace to serve." Pei Ling was stunned and hurriedly lowered her head. "Empress, my little income is poor, I may not be able to take this important task. I have the final say." Yulan stopped her, her language was unquestionable, but she had a soft heart. "You saved me, can't I believe you?" Pei Ling was helpless and had to respond, and she secretly calculated in her heart. This precious concubine Yulan seems gentle, but is actually very cunning. Although she is by her side, it is easier to collect information, but it is easier to reveal her identity. It seems that we have to be more careful next. On the other side, in the imperial book room, Prince Chenjinseng and several confidants were in secret. The light shook his handsome face a few more hairs. He held a secret letter in his hand, his eyebrows tightly locked. "Your Highness, I just received the news that concubine Yulan was assassinated in the imperial garden and was rescued by a young palace girl who was unknown to the emperor." A black-robed man said in a low voice, "The palace girl was named Pei Ling. She said that she was extremely skilled and single person retreated 7 or 8 assassins." Cheng'en's fingers knocked on the table, and a flash of excitement came to his eyes. "Oh? A little palace girl has such skills. Interesting. Do you think this person passed by chance, or did he not have a purpose?" The scholar lowered his head and tried to find out. "Your Highness, there is a tiger hiding a dragon in the palace. Maybe this Pei Ling is a chess piece installed by a certain party. Yulan concubine has been operating recently, and may be related to this matter." Cheng'en sneered, stood up and walked, with a chill in his voice. "No matter who she is, since she has entered the eyes of this palace, don't want to live in peace. Send someone to stare at her and find out her details. If it is available, you will pull it over, if there is any distraught heart. Humph, there is no shortage of people in the palace who have disappeared." "Yes, Your Highness." The monk hurriedly responded and retreated. Chen walked to the window, looked into the direction of the faraway imperial garden, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. What exactly is this Pei Ling? The water in the palace has been exhausted. If there is another river dragon, it will probably cause greater waves. At the same time, Pei Ling followed Yulan back to the palace, and was still savoring the scene just now. Yulan's eyes always made her feel indescribable, as if she was admiring or as if she was trying. She lowered her head and looked at the thin slut on her palm. It was the mark left by holding a knife for many years, reminding her that she could not let go of her vigilance no matter where she was. Pei Ling, you can stay outside my palace tonight. Yulan sat on the couch, gently squeezing her mouth, and her voice was soft and commanding tone, I believe you can protect me. Pei Ling lowered her head and said, yes, Empress. She retreated outside the hall, and the night wind blew over, bringing a sense of turmoil. Her eyes swept around, her ears capturing every strange movement. Yulan's trust came too fast, which made her feel a little uneasy. But no matter what, this first step is gone. Next, she will stand firm in this imperial palace, find out the family secrets, and find the whereabouts of her brother. Far away, a gaze fell quietly on her, with a taste of examination and excitement. Pei Ling's back felt cold and she had not turned back. She knew that the palace game had just begun. The morning light penetrates through the thin curtain of the window, and is on the carved wooden couch in the palace of the Fengyao. Jade Lan is dressed in a simple and elegant palace, leaning against the couch, and her fingers are gently squeezing a string of jade rosary. Her eyes were soft, and there was a hint of shrewdness, and her eyes fell on Pei Ling, who was standing straight away. Pei Ling, you stayed overnight, but what was the excitement? Yulan's voice was light and soft, like spring breeze blowing on her face, making people feel nervous. Pei Ling lowered her head and replied respectfully, Grandma, everything was fine last night, and I didn't see any suspicious person. I can rest with peace of mind. Yulan smiled lightly, put down the rosary, stood up and walked to Pei Ling. She stretched out her hand, picked up Pei Ling's chin, and looked at her cold eyes carefully. You are so humble, and there is a stubbornness in your eyes. Pei Ling's heart thumped, her face was not swaying, she looked shy and said in a low voice, the Empress was laughing. She was only from a country, so how could she have any stories? But she learned some rough martial arts and could only protect the Empress from being fully fond. Yulan's eyes flowed on her face for a moment, and finally withdrew her hand and said lightly, I'm so angry. No matter if you have no story, stay on the palace and learn some rules in the palace. Today, I will go to the flower party for my palace. Other people's palace girls are smart, don't give me the palace and put on my face. Yes, Empress. Pei Ling lowered her head and calculated secretly in her heart. Flower Selling Club is an international venue for valuable people in the palace. On the surface, it is a scene of flowers and tea tasting, but it is actually a battle between the palaces. Yulan took her there just to borrow the opportunity to test her adaptability, so that she could integrate into the palace circle. But this is also a good opportunity to collect information for her. Not long after, the two brought a few young girls to the flower-selling venue in the Imperial Garden. There are hundreds of flowers in the garden, and the concubines gather together, laughing and lying. As soon as Yulan arrived, she attracted a lot of attention. She smiled softly and looked at her concubine's style in every move, but she was not without losing her harmony, so that she could not find any mistakes. Sister Yulan is so elegant today. I heard that I encountered some nuisance last night, but was it hurt? A concubine in a blue palace dressed in a lake came up with a smile, her temperament was intimate, and her eyes were filled with the light of exploration. Yulan smiled lightly, holding concubine Li's hand, and her voice was soft, I thank my sister for being so worried, but it was just a few small flies. Fortunately, this little palace girl was saved by this little palace girl, so she was not very tired. As she said, she pointed lightly at Pei Ling behind her, and she had a glimpse of her eyes. The eyes of the crowd fell on Pei Ling, carrying a look of examination and curiosity. Pei Ling lowered her head, and her face was filled with a tight and cramped look, and everyone's expression was in her eyes. Concubine Li raised her eyebrows and whispered, Oh. It's so strange that a little palace girl can save concubine Gue. Come and raise her head and let the palace see what kind of pretty head is. Pei Ling had no choice but to raise her head and reveal her handsome face that was not without her youth. Her eyes drooped, and her voice was light and delicate. Little Pei Ling, have seen Concubine Li. Concubine Li looked at her and suddenly smiled. I'm pretty good, I just look a little bit old. Sister Yulan, this girl is new, right? Why is she so good at it? Could it be that someone from a valuable family? Yulan patted Concubine Li's hand lightly and smiled and said, my sister is so worried. This girl is just a little kid from a country. I saw her in an old age and stayed there. Well, today is a gift, so I don't feel happy. Everyone saw that Yulan wanted to change the topic, but they stopped chasing it, but their eyes kept snoring at Pei Ling and exploring it with a few points. Pei Ling stood behind Yulan, lowering her head and silently, and could feel the gazes on her back. She knew that Yulan was helping her integrate into the palace, and at the same time, she was using her special to attract attention and gain more words for herself. In the next show of flowers, Yulan carried Pei Ling through the crowd, talking and laughing, and constantly pointing in low voices on how Pei Ling should respond. She taught me carefully, and explained how to serve tea and water, how to respond to valuable people's tricks, and her words were as gentle as those of a big sister. Pei Ling listened to her seriously on the surface, and a strange feeling appeared in her heart. Yulan's concern for her seemed to be beyond her charge. Pei Ling, look at that Qin Gong, smiling with a full smile, I love to pick things up the most. If she asks you later, remember to be humble and don't let her catch the handle. Yulan jingled in a low voice, put her fingers on Pei Ling's arm, feeling warm. Pei Ling pointed her head, pressed her heart down and said in a low voice, thank you, Empress, I've remembered it. Yulan looked at her, and there was a flash of smile in her eyes, and she didn't say more. The two men, one master and one servant, cooperated strangely. At the flower-making party, Yulan used her charm to deal with the crowd. Pei Ling resolved several times of Xiao Diao's difficulties with a humble attitude, and gradually made people believe her country origin. However, this calm did not last long. After the flowers were scattered, Yulan took Pei Ling back to the palace, and when he passed a remote long corridor, it suddenly became strange. A young lady came over in a panic, holding a letter in her hand, and a quick voice, Empress knew, it's not good. This is an urgent letter sent from the palace. It is said that it has something to do with you, and the servant dare not delay it, so he sent it specially. Yulan's eyebrows were snaking, she took the envelope, opened it and saw that her face changed. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her voice was low. How is this possible? Pei Ling stood aside, her eyes swept over the letter paper, only seeing a few sloppy lines of words written on it, and mentioned the words, re-recommended old things, and, blood debt. She felt nervous, and she didn't look vocal on her face, and asked in a low voice, Empress, what's wrong with it? Yulan took a deep breath, clenched the letter paper, and smiled nervously, no big deal, it's just some old things about Qin Yan. This palace is a little tired, so go back to the palace to rest first. You go to the imperial kitchen to get some peace of mind soup. Pei Ling responded and turned away, secretly alert in her heart. This letter was too coincidental, but it was sent after the flower-making ceremony, which made Yulan feel nervous, and I was afraid that someone would deliberately do it. On the surface, she walked towards the imperial kitchen, turned her foot and walked to the back of the long corridor, observing quietly behind an old tree. Sure enough, within a moment, two figures appeared sneakily in the long corridor. One of them said in a low voice, the letter has been sent, and concubine Gue must be in a terrible state. Your Highness said that if there is any problem with this little palace Jurchen, he will definitely be exposed. Let's keep a closer eye to see if she is unrest. The other man pointed his head and lowered his voice, don't worry, your Highness's eyes are all over the palace, and this girl is hard to fly with her wings. Pei Ling heard the word, Your Highness, and her heart sank. It seems that this is the handwriting of the Prince Qinzhen, and the picture is to try to find out whether she has a deeper connection with Yulan. She sneered, her figure flashed, quietly lying behind the two people, her fingers bounced lightly, and two small stones accurately hit the back of the knees of the two people. The other party was in pain, exclaimed softly, and fell to the ground, but she didn't even see her shadow. Who? The two of them turned in panic, only seeing the empty corridor. The cold wind blew over, bringing an inexplicable killing. Pei Ling had already retreated back to the original path, and with a humble smile on her face, she returned to the palace of Fengyao with a calm soup. When Yulan saw her coming back, she smiled reluctantly, took the soup bowl, and said lightly, "You are so tired, you should do things quickly. This palace is a little tired, so you can go down first, don't be able to stay tonight." Pei Ling lowered her head and retreated outside the hall, calculating in her heart. Yulan's feelings were obviously inconsistent, and the letter must have touched some of her pain points. Although the Prince Chang'an's trial was temporarily resolved by her, her skills undoubtedly attracted the attention of the other party. The two stones just now, although they have not appeared, they have left traces of secret use. If they are seen by those who are interested, they may cause even more trouble. The night was getting deeper, and Pei Ling stood outside the hall alone, recalling today's species in her brain. The gentleness of Yulan, the prince's trial, the undercurrent of the palace, everything is like a big net, trapping her firmly in it. She looked down at the thin robe on her palm, her eyes cold. No matter what, she must tear apart a path of life on this website, find her brother, and keep the family secrets. On the other side, in the imperial book room, Chang'an listened to his subordinate's reply, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. "You said that those two people were knocked down, but they didn't even see the other party's shadow?" Humph, this Pei Ling is indeed not simple. It seems that this palace has to meet her. He got up, walked to the window, looked into the direction of the far-off palace, and a sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth. "Yellow, Yulan, there is a dragon hidden beside you. I want to see how big a wave this dragon can cause." At the same time, in the palace of the turtle, Yulan sat alone on the couch, holding the letter in her hands, her eyes chaotic. She said in a low voice, "Pei Ling, who are you? Why? I always think that you have something to do with me that I can't tell." Her eyes penetrated the window and landed on the lonely figure outside the hall, with a touch of gentleness and exploration flashing in her eyes. The night wind is faint, and the emotions between the two people are like a taboo flower in this palace, sprouting quietly, and are extremely dangerous. Pei Ling stood outside the hall, as if she felt something. She raised her head and looked into the window, facing Yulan's gaze far away. Both of them were stunned, and immediately moved their eyes, and a wave appeared in their hearts. She knew that this emotion, whether true or false, would become the most dangerous test of her palace career. The night was dark, and the long corridor outside the palace was silent and soundless, only the occasional horns and the footsteps of the patrolman. Pei Ling stood outside the hall, her back straightened, her eyes swept around like a knife, and her ears captured every movement. The uneasiness in her heart calmed down slightly as her fingertips touched the cold hilt. The relationship between Yulan and her last night was like a stone plunging into the calm lake, causing ripples. Pei Ling knew that this emotion was dangerous, especially in this undercurrent palace. But she couldn't deny that Yulan's tenderness and trust made a warm feeling in her cold heart, that was the feeling she had never felt as dark as a person. "Pei Ling, come in." The soft voice of Yulan from the hall interrupted her thoughts. Pei Ling lowered her head and pushed the door in. Yulan has changed into a moon-white wardrobe, her long hair is scattered on her shoulders, and she lacks the power of the daytime concubine, which makes her more gentle. She sat on the couch, holding a book in her hand, and saw Pei Ling coming in, and smiled lightly. "Why are you standing so far tonight? Look at me, you seem to have something to worry about." Pei Ling felt nervous, and she didn't show any voice on her face. She replied respectfully, "The Empress is so careless, she is just a little tired, and there is nothing else." Yulan put down the book, stood up and walked to her, looking at her face in detail. Her eyes were gentle, and she had a little exploration. "Is it tired? Look at me, the light in your eyes is not as bright as it is. Pei Ling, you saved me, I believe in you. But if you believe in someone here, the price is often larger than you think. Do you understand the meaning of me?" Pei Ling lowered her head and turned her mind. Yulan is trying to find her, and reminding her that there is no real trust in the palace, only interests and utilization. But the concern in her words made Pei Ling feel warm. She replied lightly, "The little one remembers the kindness of the empress. No matter what the palace is, the little one only knows to protect the empress, and don't ask for anything else." Yulan heard this, and a complex light flashed in her eyes. She whispered lightly, reached out and patted Pei Ling on the shoulder, "Silly, who is in this palace uncontrollably? I'm so angry, you should rest today, this palace doesn't need anyone to watch the night." Pei Ling also wanted to recommend it, but Yulan had turned back to the couch, and her vocals were unquestionable. "Go, don't you hear the words of this palace?" Pei Ling had no choice but to retreat. Back to her small side, she did not fall asleep, but sat on the bed with her knees, closed her eyes and reminisced about the recent kinds in her brain. The Prince Qingyan's trial, Yulan's emotions, the mysterious letter, everything is like a net, making her become more and more nervous as she gets sleepy. She must find a breakthrough as soon as possible, otherwise once her identity is exposed, not only will her mission fail, but her life will be in danger. At the same time, in the imperial book room, fire was swaying, and the Prince Qingyan and Hanlin were sitting in secret. Qingyan was wearing a black dragon robe, with a majestic atmosphere and a jade pendant in his hand, his eyes were cold. Hanlin sat down with a tall face and a low voice, "Your Highness, the little palace girl Pei Ling is not simple. The person I sent to was knocked down last night, but he didn't even see the other party's shadow. According to the old minister, she is definitely not an ordinary palace girl, and may be a chess piece inserted by some party." Qingyan sneered and put down his jade pendant, saying, "Chess piece? I want to see who she is. Yulan has been operating in recent times, and he may not be able to get along with this girl. Hanlin, do you have a way to try her true face?" Hanlin twisted his beard and saw a sly look in his eyes. "Your Highness, the old minister has a plan. After the morning court tomorrow, Your Highness may pretend to invite concubine Yulan to Dongyuan to give the scenery, and secretly ordered people to disseminate the news, claiming that there is a secret treasure hidden in the palace in Dongyuan. If Pei Ling is really secretly, she will take the opportunity to investigate. At that time, we will set up an ambush and force her to show her true form. If she really has problems, Your Highness can use this to make her use for her. If she is innocent, she is not just a little palace girl, just remove it at will." Qingyan heard the sound of a smile, and he felt satisfied in his eyes and said, "Okay, it's up to you. Remember, this matter needs to be done secretly, so don't make Yulan suspicious. In addition, send someone to keep an eye on the palace, and everyone should know everything about Pei Ling." "Yes, Your Highness." Hanlin hurriedly lowered his head and retreated. The next morning, after the meeting ended, Qingyan really mentioned the new scenery of Dongyuan in front of the crowd, and invited Yulan with a smile. Yulan smiled softly and happily. As she turned around, her eyes flashed slightly, and she swept over Pei Ling behind her, as if she had a deep meaning. Back at the Fengya Palace, Yulan retreated from the left and right, leaving Pei Ling alone on the side. She said in a low voice, "Pei Ling, today the prince invited this palace to Dongyuan. What do you think is wrong?" Pei Ling's heart was moved, and she didn't show any voice on her face, and replied humbly, "Empress, it is common for His Highness the Crown Prince to invite you to see the scenery. The little foolish man can't see any inappropriate points. But Dongyuan is remote, and if Empress goes there, she needs to bring more attendants to prevent her from being detected." Yulan smiled lightly, walked to her side, and said softly, "You are so stupid, and you are smarter than anyone else in your heart. It's true that Dongyuan is remote, but the prince is afraid that the drunkard's intention is not to drink. I heard that it was recently spread in the palace that there was a miserable secret treasure hidden in Dongyuan, and even the father asked about this. Do you think the prince will make a fuss with this?" Pei Ling was shocked, and she looked confused and tried to ask, "What the empress mean is that the prince wants to use the secret treasure to try to find out?" Yulan points with deep eyes, "It's good. Everyone in this palace may be the goal, including you and me. Pei Ling, I believe in you, but you have to rest assured. You will go to this palace today. If you have any emotions, remember to protect yourself and protect your palace. Pei Ling lowered her head and looked alert in her heart. Yulan's words were trust on the surface, but in fact they were also trying to find out her reaction to the secret treasure. The prince's invitation and rumors were clearly implicated in her. As a secret, she was her specialty in collecting information, and this little trick was still too jealous of her eyes. But how to deal with it is not only to expose your identity, but also to resolve the crisis, but also to consider it carefully. After noon, Yulan brought Pei Ling and several servants to Dongyuan. The scenery in the garden is pleasant, and the flowing waters of the rockery are hidden in tranquility, but there is an inexplicable tightness in the air. Ching'an had already been waiting here. When he saw Yulan arrive, he greeted him with a smile. Yulan concubine is very beautiful today. The scenery of Dongyuan is worthy of your style. Yulan smiled lightly and was slightly blessed. I thank your highness for your award. I'm just here to be so enthusiastic. After a few greetings from the two, Ching'an's eyes kept snoring at Pei Ling, carrying a difficult-to-see review. He suddenly laughed and said, I heard that this little palace girl is very skilled. Today, there are many people in Dongyuan, so it is better to let her go to patrol the palace for a while, so that she can protect Princess. Yulan was stunned and immediately smiled and pointed, Your Highness is intent. Pei Ling, go, remember to be careful. Pei Ling lowered her head and left with several servants from Qinzhen, and sneered in her heart. The prince is trying to investigate openly, but he is afraid that he has already set up a trap in secret. On the surface, she followed the waiter to patrol, and her eyes quickly swept around, and noticed that there were signs of ambushing after a few grasslands. But far away, a young lady was sneaking behind the rockery, as if she was holding something in her hand, her eyes glancing at her from time to time. This sister, there is a path ahead. I heard that there are often palace people and things. Why don't we go and have a look? A servant suddenly opened his mouth, carrying a spell in his language. Pei Ling was moved, and she looked cautious when she put it on her face, and said lightly, Since it's a patrol, you should follow the rules and follow the rules. The path is remote, and if you don't know, it's hard to explain. The waiter was stunned, as if he hadn't expected her to refuse, so he smiled reluctantly, I'm so angry, I just heard from my sister. The group continued to move forward, and Pei Ling secretly kept a secret. She pretended to lower her head and tidy up her sleeves, her fingers flashed lightly, and a small hidden weapon quietly shot at the Xiao Taisho behind the rockery without any noise. The man hummed a little, and the thing in his hand fell to the ground, making a sound. Pei Ling was quick-eyed and quickly picked up and saw that it turned out to be a letter with words like, The secret treasure is hidden in the dry well in Dongyuan. She sneered in her heart, it was indeed the prince's hand. This letter was clearly left to her on purpose. If she really went to explore the dry well, she would definitely fall into an ambush. But she didn't say anything, but quietly stuffed the letter back into her sleeve and continued to patrol with the waiter, without any trace on her face. At the same time, Qinzhen and Yulan were tasting tea in the pavilion. The atmosphere seemed harmonious, but it actually contained a hidden machine. Qinzhen smiled and said, Pei Ling beside concubine Gui, looking at her old age, but I heard that she is very good at having sex, even assassins can retreat. Can concubine Gui know her arrival? Yulan was swaying with tea and smiled softly, Your Highness is so attentive. Pei Ling is just a little girl from a country and has learned some rough martial arts. I'm just keeping her by my side, but I just want to feel at ease. Qinzhen raised his eyebrows and held a tentative test in his language, Oh. I was born in the country. I think she is not like an ordinary palace girl. Princess Gui should not be blinded. If she does not have any intention, it may be unfavorable to Princess Gui. Yulan's smile remained unchanged and said lightly, Your Highness is kind, I am grateful. But Pei Ling saved my life and I believe her. If you have any doubts, you might as well check yourself, but I will never be careless. Ching'en's eyes flashed with a cold light, but he didn't ask again, but just smiled and said, Concubine Gui is kind-hearted, and I am sure of it. However, the palace has not been peaceful recently, so concubine Gui is more careful. The two people hid their swords in their faces, and they were in harmony. On the other side, Pei Ling had completed the inspection and returned to the pavilion. She lowered her head and reported, "Go back to the queen and your highness, everything is well around Dongyuan, and there is no difference." Cheng'en's eyes flashed and he asked with a smile, "Is it really strange? I heard from this palace that there are some rumors in Dongyuan recently, saying that there are some secret treasures hidden. When you inspect, do you see any suspicious points?" Pei Ling felt nervous, and she was confused on her face, and she replied respectfully, "When you go back to your highness, the young man only knows patrol, and has not heard any rumors, nor has she seen any suspicious points. If your highness has any doubts, the young man wants to investigate again." Cheng'en stared at her, and the test picture showed the brokenness from her face, but Pei Ling lowered her head, so humble that she couldn't find a mistake. He snorted coldly and said, "I'm so angry, I just asked casually, you go back." Pei Ling responded and retreated behind Yulan, and felt a secret relaxed in her heart. She knew that the prince had passed the time of this, but the other party's suspicion would only be even worse. Pei Ling took the letter from her sleeve for a moment, sent it to Yulan, and said in a low voice, "Empress, during the small patrol, I found that the letter fell behind the rockery, and it seemed that someone deliberately abandoned it. What secret treasures mentioned in the letter are probably related to the prince's current situation." Yulan received the letter and looked at it carefully, and her face changed slightly. She said in a low voice, "It's indeed the prince's hand. He wants to use the secret treasure to try to find you and me. Pei Ling, you haven't won the plan today and have done a good job. But since the prince has already aroused his doubts, there will be a bigger move next. Are you right?" Pei Ling lowered her head, with a flash of shiny eyes, and said in a low voice, "Empress, although the young man is not talented, there are some ways. Since the prince wants to try, it is better for us to oppose the army and let him be stubborn." Yulan was stunned and immediately smiled and said, "Oh? You have an idea. Let's listen." Pei Ling said in a low voice, "Empress, since the prince has scattered rumors about secret treasures, he will definitely send someone to monitor the dry well in the East Garden. We might as well plan to pretend to be suspicious people, explore the dry well at night, and lead to the prince's ambush. At the same time, the young man will secretly sneak into the imperial book room and collect secret evidence of the prince and the Hanlin. As long as he holds the handle, the prince dare not act rashly." Yulan heard the sound of the eyes, and then she felt a little more appreciative, and then she felt a little worried. "This is wonderful, it is extremely dangerous. The Imperial Book Guard is so strict. If you are discovered, you may not escape. Pei Ling, this palace. I don't want you to take this big risk." Pei Ling felt warm and replied calmly, "Empress, since you are trusted, you will not be in danger. Please rest assured that the young man will protect himself and protect him well." Yulan looked at her with a cumbersome look, and finally she said, "I will believe you after being rude. But remember, if you don't know, save your life first. This palace waits for you to come back." Her words are gentle and contain a touch of emotion that is hard to describe. Pei Ling felt a little nervous, raised her head and met Yulan, and there were waves in her eyes. She said in a low voice, "Empress, I must be entrusted with you." That night, Pei Ling arranged everything and took advantage of the dark moon and high winds to enter the imperial book room. Her skills are like ghosts, she avoids her eyes and ears, and she easily penetrates the room. There were a pile of secret letters on the desk. She quickly flipped through it and finally found a letter of contact between Hanlin and Qinzhen. The content directly pointed to the incident of Dongyuan Chifu, and even mentioned the unfavorable plan for Yulan. She hid the letter and was about to leave when she heard the sound of her feet coming out of the door. "Who is inside?" Shou Wei snorted, and the sound of the sword coming out of the sheath rose. Pei Ling's heart tightened and quickly flipped out from the window, and her body disappeared into the night like an electric shock. At the same time, in the dry well in Dongyuan, the people arranged by Yulan pretended to investigate, which led to an ambush. The two sides fought and formed a group. Qin Zhen received the news and hurried to Dongyuan, leaving nothing to see his subordinates. The next day, Yulan used the letter as a witness and secretly warned Qin Zhen that if there were any minor actions, he would report the matter to the emperor. Qing En was afraid of the mouse and had to stop at once, but when he looked at Pei Ling's gaze, he became colder and colder, and it seemed that he had already seen her as a gaze in his eyes. Inside the palace of Fenglan, Yulan finally relaxed her voice when she looked at Pei Ling, who had come to her safely. She said lightly, "Pei Ling, you did a good job. But I know that the prince will not rest here. Do you want to stay by our palace and spend this palace with us?" Pei Ling was shocked. Looking at the gentleness and stinging in Yulan's eyes, she understood that this emotion had exceeded her patronage. But she also knew that this taboo was extremely expensive, and might push the two people to a disaster. She said in a low voice, "Empress, I wish you to be considerate, no matter when." Yulan smiled lightly, and a hint of pain in her eyes. "Okay, I have recorded it. However, in this palace, the word love is the most harmful. You and I are afraid that they all have to pay." The night rose again, and the two of them said nothing, and they all understood in their hearts that this emotion was like a double blade, both warm and dangerous. The palace's wind is still curling bigger storms, waiting for them. The night was so thick that it could not be melted, and a roaring light in the palace of the Fengyuan palace shook, reflecting the Jadelon's faces flashed and dark. She sat on the couch, holding a piece of paper with her fingers, and her eyebrows were slightly frowning, as if she was worried. Pei Ling stood outside the hall. Although she had not entered the hall, she could feel the uneasiness radiating from Yulan's body. Since the incident in Dongyuan, although the Prince Qin Zhen was on the surface, the actions in secret became more and more frequent, and the feelings of Yulan became more and more unstable. "Pei Ling, come in." Yulan's voice came from the hall, carrying a faint and exhausted feeling. Pei Ling pushed the door in, lowered her head and said respectfully, "Empress, what instructions do you have?" Yulan looked up at her, and with a slight voice, she stood up and walked to her, with a difficult-to-speak complexity in her speech. In the past few days, this palace always felt unconscious. Although the prince has not tried to explore clearly, his eyes are not there. And the Hanlin, who has recently entered the palace and negotiated with the prince, may be planning something. Have you heard any sound?" Pei Ling felt nervous, and she didn't show any voice on her face. She replied in a low voice, "Empress, the young man has heard some rumors recently, saying that Hanlin's dissemination of the words that were not conducive to the empress in the court seemed to have something to do with the old things in the palace. But the specifics are not yet clear. If the empress agrees, the young man will want to inquire about it." Yulan heard the sound of his eyes were slightly flashed, and after a moment of silence, he said lightly, "I know that you are extraordinary and you are good at collecting information. But Hanlin is a man with a poisonous mind. If he really acts, he will not easily reveal his horse. If you go to investigate, there may be danger. This palace, I don't want you to involve this." Pei Ling raised her head and faced Yulan's gaze. Seeing that her eyes were full of concern, her heart couldn't help but feel warm. She said softly, "Empress, the young one is trusted by you, and you will not be in danger. If Hanlin really has a rudeness, the young one will not be at ease if he doesn't find out. Please rest assured that the young one will be careful, protect yourself and protect you." Yulan looked at her, her eyes flashed with a touch of tenderness and twitching. Finally, she pointed at her head and said lightly, "Okay, I believe in you. But remember, if you don't know, save your life first. This palace waits for you to come back safely." In her language, there was a feeling that was difficult to cover up. Pei Ling felt a little worried and didn't say much, but just lowered her head. She knew that this emotion was even more dangerous, but she could not deny it. Yulan's concern made a warm feeling in her cold heart, that was something she had never felt as dark as a person. That night, Pei Ling changed into a night-mounted dress, and shed out of the Fengyuan palace like a ghost, and headed straight for the Hanlin mansion. Although the Hanlon was an important official in the court, his mansion was not in the imperial palace, but in a quiet place on the south side of the capital. She used the experience of the darkness to avoid patrol and attend the patrol and easily climbed over the high wall and penetrated into the mansion. The lights in the mansion were dim, and occasionally there were servants talking in a low voice, and their feet were reverberating on the bluestone path. Pei Ling was hidden behind an old tree, her eyes swept around like a keel, and soon locked in Hanlon's bookroom, the most rigorous guarding there, and there were lights flashing from time to time. It was obvious that someone was discussing secrets. She held her breath, her feet were pointed lightly, and several lifts and lands came to the house outside the bookroom. Through the window, she knew the low voice that came from it. The sound was the unique cold word of Hanlon. If the old story of concubine Yulan was exposed to the sacred temple, she would definitely lose her. By then, not only would she weaken her power, but she would also reveal her identity with the little palace girl. Your Highness, this plan of killing 2 birds is absolutely wonderful. Another voice was low and with a slight disgust. It was the Prince Chungan's confidant. My lord, this is wonderful, but concubine Yulan has a weak foundation in the palace. If she doesn't have any real trouble, it may be difficult for her to overthrow her. Moreover, Pei Ling's skills are strange, if she intervenes, it will make us difficult. Hanlon sneered, his lingering was full of poison. Is it true? I naturally have a way. Before Yulan entered the palace that year, he had had a relationship with a person from the world. Although he had not succeeded, he left a letter as evidence. As long as the matter was rendered into a palace crow, he made a few more letters to prove that she had an inseparable relationship with the little palace girl. The Holy Lord would be furious. By then, Yulan was defeated, and Pei Ling could not escape the connection. Pei Ling was shocked when she heard this, and her fingers couldn't help but tighten the dagger in her sleeve. Hanlon's sarcasm is so straightforward and vicious. Not only did he destroy Yulan, he also wanted to drag her into the water to create a larger palace wind. She gritted her teeth and made up her mind to kill this slap in the slaughter, no matter what. She moved her window to see. Her eyes swept across the interior of the book room and saw Hanlon taking out a small wooden box from under the bookcase, which seemed to be loaded with several letters. She felt a little nervous and decided to take advantage of the opportunity to get the certificate. But at this moment, a rapid sound of footsteps suddenly came outside the book room, and a waiter said in a low voice, "Sir, I just received the news that someone in the palace visited Dongyuan at night. Does the manpower of Yulan Princess need to be sent to investigate?" Hanlon was stunned and sneered immediately. What a jade lane, you dare to rebel against our army. If you send people over, you must capture someone in your current situation. In addition, the guardianship of the book room is doubled. If there is any movement, don't worry about the killing. Pei Ling felt nervous and knew that she didn't have much time left. She quickly decided to make a tough move. She took out a smoke bomb from her waist and slammed it out of the book room. The smoke was always flowing, and the guards were shocked and their feet were chaotic. She took advantage of the trouble and climbed into the window. Her body was like electricity, and she was straight into Hanlon. Who are you? Pei Ling snorted coldly, and the short dagger flashed and rushed directly into Hanlon's throat. Her voice was low, "Sold the box, you won't die." Hanlon's face was blue and unwilling to be outdone, and shouted, "Come on. There is an assassin." The guards' voices were inserted into each other, and the swords were rushing out, and the Pei Ling group was surrounded in an instant. A cold light flashed in her eyes, and her body was like a ghost and shuttled through the sword-light shadow. Every strike was accurate and fatal. Her martial arts are far superior to ordinary people. Although these guardians are numerous, they are not her opponent at all. As the sword light passes, blood rises, and the cry is not endless. Hanlon saw that the victory was not good and turned around and wanted to escape. Pei Ling rushed forward with a quick step, flipped her wrist, and put a short dagger between him. At the same time, her other hand over the wooden box and said coldly, "Wait a little longer, your life will be gone." Hanlon's face turned pale and said loudly, "Who are you? How dare you stay in my mansion? Do you know that I am an important official in the court?" Pei Ling sneered and said in a low voice, "Stop talking, I'll take these letters away. If you dare to be unfavorable to concubine Wu again, I will definitely take your lead." Speaking of the slightest, she slapped her palm and hit the Hanlin back, knocking her to the ground. At the same time, more guards came from all over the mansion, shouting and killing were shocking. Pei Ling knew that she could not fight, so she stuffed the wooden box into the cage, flashed her body, and flipped out of the book room, and rushed out of the mansion. But she just rushed out of nowhere and heard a cold shout, "Stop! Where can I save my life?" Before the words could be finished, a storm arrow broke through the air and shot straight into her heart. Pei Ling flashed her side, and the arrows brushed against her sleeves, and rushed into the trees beside her, making a buzzing sound. She looked up and saw a man in black standing at the door of the mansion, holding a long bow in his hand, and was swaying, which was obviously the top guard in the Hanlin mansion. "Want to leave? It's not that easy." The man in black sneered, and several arrows burst into pieces, like meteors, blocking Pei Ling's retreat. Pei Ling bit her teeth tightly, her feet pointed at her feet, and her body rose up in the air, flipping continuously in the air, avoiding the arrows. Her wrist shook, and several hidden weapons reflected out, directly reaching the other party's key point. The man in black was shocked and hurriedly avoided him, but he was still hit by a hidden weapon, and hummed and moved slightly. Pei Ling grabbed the gap in this moment and rushed out of the mansion, her figure quickly did not fall into the night. The sound of killing behind her was unstoppable, but she used the dark body technique to scatter the pursuits at several ups and downs and disappeared in the alleys of the capital. When I returned to the palace of Fengya, a white fish turned pale on the sky. Pei Ling changed back to the palace girl's dress, quietly dived back to the side without any noise, took out the wooden box and checked it in detail. There were indeed several letters in the box, one of which wrote a private matter before Yulan entered the palace. Although there was no real evidence, it was enough to be used by those who were interested and rendered like a joke. The other few letters were actually written by a manuscript, and the content pointed out that Yulan had an inseparable relationship with her. The lines in the words were full of a challenge and separation. Pei Ling looked at her and saw a cold light flashing in her eyes. She hid the letter and decided to hand it over to Yulan after dawn, and at the same time discussed the proposal. Hanlin is obviously trying to kill two birds with one stone, not only destroying Yulan, but also dragging her into the water. She knew that if this wind wave was not properly handled, the consequences would be unbelievable. The next morning, Pei Ling presented the wooden box to Yulan, and said in a low voice that happened last night one by one. Yulan heard the sound of her face turned pale, and her fingers flicked through the letters with a burst of anger in her voice. "What a Hanlin, how dare you frame me like this? If these letters really hit my father, I will be disgusted with you. I will be connected." Pei Ling lowered her head and said with a sound of determination, "Empress, since the letter has been received, Hanlin will be unwilling. His traits are mostly disappointed. Next, just plan to make him suffer the consequences. If the Empress believes in the small, the young can arrange people and spread the news, and ask Hanlin to create letters to trap the rich. If this matter is passed into the ears of the Holy Lord, Hanlin will be unable to let him go." Yulan heard it, and there was a flash of appreciation in her eyes, but she also felt a little worried. This is wonderful, but Hanlin and the prince have a deep foundation. If they fight back, it may be detrimental to you and me. Pei Ling, you committed suicide alone last night and have already taken great risks. This palace. I don't want you to get involved again. Pei Ling raised her head and met Yulan. Seeing that her eyes were full of concern and tumbling, her heart couldn't help but feel warm. She said in a low voice, "Empress, since the young man chooses to protect you, he will not be able to feel any storm. Over the years, the young man has long been keen on life on the tip of a knife to survive. The safety of the young man is the only thing he wants." Yulan heard this, and a flash of water flashed in her eyes and said lightly, "Silly, who is in this palace involuntarily? What kind of virtue can you fight for the palace so hard?" She put it on, reached out and held Pei Ling's hand lightly, with a sob in her voice. "Pei Ling, if one day the palace is lost, will you leave? Pei Ling was shocked and felt the warmth in Yulan's palm. She almost couldn't help but wanted to hold it back, but reasonably told her that this emotion was a taboo and a danger. She said in a low voice, Empress, since the young one has thanked you, he will not leave. Regardless of the wind and rain, the young one will accompany you. Yulan's eyes flashed with a gentle smile, and she didn't say more. She relaxed her hands, turned back to the couch, and said in a low voice, I've been rude, I believe you. Do your plan, but remember to be careful. I'm waiting for good news. Pei Ling lowered her head and felt a little wavy in her heart. She knew that this emotion was getting deeper and deeper, but she also understood that this taboo was extremely expensive, and might push the two people to a disaster. But no matter what, she couldn't turn around, for the sake of Yulan and for her unfinished mission. In the next few days, Pei Ling secretly arranged people to spread news, and said that Hanlin had created a letter to plot against concubine Gui. The news spread like wildfire and soon reached the emperor's ears. The emperor was furious and ordered the investigation to be investigated. The Hanlin people were finally suspended from their duties and waiting for the results of the investigation. However, this wave has not subsided. Although the Prince Qinzhen was not connected, he became more vigilant about Pei Ling's actions. He had a secret meeting with his confidant in the imperial book room, and his words were cold, this Pei Ling is indeed not simple. Hanlin's plan was destroyed by her, and her eyes were not found out from her. It seems that her palace had to take action to make her realize her true form. At the same time, although Yulan's status was kept at a low price, the rumors in the court were not overwhelmed, and the eyes of everyone's eyes at her became more and more complicated. She sat alone in the hall, looking at the moonlight outside the window, her eyes full of fatigue. Pei Ling stood outside the hall, calmly guarding her, and could feel the pressure and loneliness of the Jade ladies. Pei Ling, come in and talk to me. Yulan's voice came from the hall, carrying a weak feeling that was difficult to describe. Pei Ling pushed the door and saw Yulan leaning against the couch, her face was white, and she smiled strongly. She felt nervous and said in a low voice, Empress, is there any inappropriate situation? Please go to the doctor too much. Yulan shook his head and said lightly, No, this palace is just a little tired. These days, rumors have spread in the court. Although this palace has not lost its power, it is like walking on thin ice. Pei Ling, if you were not here, this palace would have been unable to hold on. Pei Ling lowered her head and said in a low voice, Empress, since the little one is by your side, it will not cause anyone to harm you. The rumors will eventually dissipate. The Empress only needs to wait and the little one will clear you up. Yulan looked at her, her eyes flashed with emotion, and she said lightly, You are always so hard-mouthed and soft-hearted. I know that what you did for this palace is more than what a palace girl should do. Pei Ling, I have you in my heart. As soon as this happened, both of them were stunned. Yulan seemed to realize that he had lost his words, so he quickly turned his eyes and said lightly, It's so hard, it's late at night, go and rest. This palace should be asleep. Pei Ling lowered her head and retreated outside the hall, making her heart difficult to calm down for a long time. Yulan's words, You are in your heart, are like a fire, igniting the deepest emotions in her heart. She knew that this taboo was unsuppressed, but she also understood that the turmoil in this palace was still curling the greater storm, waiting for them. The night was dark, and inside and outside the Fengyuan palace was silent, with only two hearts. In this dangerous palace, it was quietly approaching, and was full of dangers. The night was as dark as ink, and the lights in the Turtle Palace emitted a faint light, reflecting the dim yellow inside the palace. Yulan sat on the couch, holding a corner of the squid with her fingers, her eyebrows slightly frowned, as if she was thinking about something. Her eyes swept back to the lonely figure outside the hall, with complex emotions in her eyes. Pei Ling stood under the long corridor, her back straightened, her eyes swept around like a knife, and her ears captured every movement of her silk. Since the Hanlin's tragedy was defeated by her, the rumors in the palace have stopped, but the undercurrent has become increasingly turbulent, making her afraid to relax. Pei Ling, come in. Yulan's voice came from the hall, carrying a faint and exhausted feeling. Pei Ling pushed the door in, lowered her head and said respectfully, Empress, what instructions do you have? Yulan looked up at her, and with a light voice, she stood up and walked up to her. Her speech was filled with indescribable concern. In the past few days, I saw that you always looked nervous, but what voice did you hear? Although Hanlon was suspended from his job, I am afraid that the prince would not be willing to let go. What are your plans? Pei Ling felt nervous, and she didn't show any voice on her face. She replied in a low voice, Empress, the young man has heard some news. After Hanlon was suspended, the prince was not involved in the surface, but he had secretly regarded him as a scapegoat, as if he was looking for a scapegoat to calm the anger of the sacred. The young man thought that this was the good opportunity for us to fight back. Yulan heard the sound of her eyebrows slightly raised, and a gleam in her eyes. You are so good at calculating. However, the prince's foundation is deep and the eyes are endless. If he acts in a regular manner, he may cause trouble. This palace does not want you to take another big risk. Pei Ling raised her head and faced Yulan's gaze. Seeing that her eyes were filled with worry, her heart couldn't help but feel warm. She said in a low voice, Empress, since the young man has chosen to protect you, he will not be in trouble. The letters of the prince and Hanlon are already in the hands of the young man. This is an iron certificate. As long as the operation is done properly, the prince will be able to be stubborn. Please rest assured, the young man will act carefully. Yulan looked at her, silent for a moment, and finally said lightly, I believe in you. I will remember that. If you don't know, save your life first. This palace waits for you to come back safely. In her voice, there was a difficult feeling to cover up, which made Pei Ling feel ill. Pei Ling lowered her head and retreated outside the hall, calculating in her heart. She knew that this battle was extremely important. If the prince could be successfully weakened, it would not only give the breathing space for the Yulan, but also allow her to stand firm in this palace. But she also understood that the prince's acceptance of his kindness is not easy to be with. In this game, if you are not careful, you will be in danger of robbery. The next morning, Pei Ling secretly arranged personnel to slightly modify the content of the Hanlon and the prince's letters, and put them into a confession written by the Hanlon's letters, which pointed out that the prince instructed him to create a letter and trap the concubine Yulan, and imply that the prince had a greater sarcasm. Later, through the secret organization, she sent this confession to the censorate anonymously, and at the same time spread the news that Hanlon had been exposed for his crimes, and intended to recommend all mistakes to the prince in order to protect himself. The news spread like wildfire, and soon caused a huge wave in the court. After receiving the confession, the censorate immediately reported to the emperor that Hanlon and the crown prince had the intention of being disobedient and needed to investigate the matter. The emperor was furious and ordered the Hanlon to be escorted to Dali Temple for review, and summoned the Prince Qingzhen to the palace for a question. For a while, there was a sensation in the court, and everyone in the prince was in danger. In the imperial book room, Cheng'en's face was blue and his fingers were tightly clutching the armrest of the dragon chair, his eyes filled with anger. He looked at the kneeling confidant below and said coldly, What's going on? How dare that old thing Hanlon pour dirty water onto our palace? What are you doing? Can't even watch out for such a small matter. The scholar was timid in the battle and replied with a low head, Your Highness, calm down. This matter is not what Hanlon did. According to the following, this confession is a bit confusing. Although the name of Hanlon is like a Hanlon master, it is suspected of being ruined. The following is suspicion that this is the method of concubine Yulan and the little palace girl Pei Ling, intending to challenge the relationship between Your Highness and Hanlon and weaken His Highness's strength. Qingzhen snorted coldly, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. Yulan? Humph, she is a bit distracted. But what I hate the most is that Pei Ling. A little palace girl dared to destroy the good things of the palace twice. Since she is so capable, the palace lets her know what it means to be dead. The scholar hurriedly said in a low voice, Your Highness, when it is urgent, you must first separate the relationship with Hanlon. Hanlon has become a tragic son. If you protect him again, it will only make the Holy Lord suspicious of His Highness. It is better to put all the crimes on him, claiming that he had trapped concubine Wu because of his personal grudges and had nothing to do with him. In this way, your Highness can escape unstoppably and then make a decision to deal with Pei Ling. Qin Zhen was silent for a moment, and finally sneered and said, "Okay, according to your plan. Tell Dali Temple that this palace has no connection with Hanlin, and all his actions are caused by selfishness. In addition, if you send someone to keep an eye on the palace, Pei Ling's movements, this palace must know everything. This palace wants to see how much waves this way can cause." At the same time, in Dali Temple, Hanlin was taken to a prison cell, full of haggard faces, and his former erotic look was no longer visible. He looked at the confession in front of him and was so angry that he trembled and shouted, "This is not what I wrote. Someone must have been framed. I want to see the sacred, and I want to face the sacred." But the interviewer just sneered and let someone drag him down. His words were cold. "Sir, it's time to do this, so let's just explain it. Your confession is clearly written, and even the prince's name has been mentioned. Do you still want to make a mistake?" Hanlin was sitting on the ground, his eyes filled with hope. He knew that he had finished it this time, and the prince would not save him, and would even add to the point of being a trash, and would treat him as a forsaken. And the behind-the-scenes pusher, no matter who he was, played with. The news was quickly transmitted back to the Fenya Palace. Pei Ling heard it, and a cold light flashed in her eyes. She said to Yulan in a low voice, "Empress, Hanlin has become a forsaken son. In order to protect himself, the prince will definitely cut off his relationship with him. Although this matter has not been directly damaged by the prince's foundation, he has lost the hearts of the people, and the trust in him in the court will be greatly reduced. We will definitely win the first game in this battle." Yulan looked at her head and didn't see much joy on her face. Instead, she said lightly, "Pei Ling, you have done a good job, but I know that the prince is the best at enduring humiliation and being burdened. Since he abandoned Hanlin, he would vent all his anger on you and me. Next, there will be greater waves." Pei Ling lowered her head and said with a firm voice, "Empress, no matter how big the wind is, the small ones will protect you. Since the prince is a slight look at the small ones will let him know that this slight is not that easy to pull out." Yulan looked at her, with a flash of appreciation and grief in her eyes, and said lightly, "You are always hard-mouthed and soft-hearted. This palace knows that what you did for this palace is more than a palace girl. But, who in this palace is involuntarily uncontrollably? Pei Ling, if one day the palace fails, will you leave?" Pei Ling was shocked, raised her head and met Yulan. Seeing that her eyes were filled with thrust and tenderness, she almost couldn't suppress her wish to promise, but she reasonably told her that this emotion was a taboo and a danger. She said in a low voice, "Empress, since the young one has thanked you, he will not leave. Regardless of the wind and rain, the young one will accompany you." Yulan heard this, and there was a flash of water in her eyes. She smiled lightly, and she didn't say more. She turned back to the couch and said in a low voice, "I'm tired. You go down first. In the next few days, be careful, this palace will give you some breathing space." Pei Ling lowered her head and retreated outside the hall, making her heart difficult to calm down for a long time. The words from Yulan were like a fire, igniting the deepest emotions in her heart. She knew that this taboo was unsuppressed, but she also understood that the turmoil in this palace was still curling the greater storm, waiting for them. Sure enough, in the next few days, although the Prince Qin Zhen did not directly attack Yulan or Pei Ling, he secretly instructed several ministers in the court who were close friends with him to submit a memorial to impeach Yulan, claiming that she was involved in the prejudice of the government and had a connection with unknown people, with no idea. Although these memorials were indefinite, the emperor became somewhat suspicious of Yulan. Rumors broke out again in the palace, and Yulan's situation became more and more difficult. However, Yulan did not sit and wait. She quickly countered by her many years of human and influence in the palace. She first privately paid a visit to several respected old ministers, and complained about her grievances with swaying eyes, believing that everything was harmed by rumors, and at the same time secretly gave her a new gift to get their support. Later, she went to the palace to face the sacred ceremony, and expressed her affection to the emperor with a gentle and respectful attitude, saying that she never dared to deal with the government affairs, but only wanted the sacred emperor to observe clearly. The emperor saw her like this, and thought that she had not been able to do anything for many years, so he finally calmed down a little and issued an order not to pursue the matter, but also warned her not to have any suspicious consequences. Yulan Xian withdrew, and his voice secretly relaxed. She knew that although this was done, the prince's attack would not stop there, and Pei Ling, as the most capable person in her, would definitely become the opponent's primary goal. That night, Yulan returned to the Fengye Palace, retreated from the left and right, leaving Pei Ling alone on the side. She said softly, "Pei Ling, the Japanese palace has been facing a sacred situation today. But I know that the prince will not be willing to let go. Since he sees you as a gaze in his eyes, he will definitely find ways to get rid of you. This palace has already given you some breathing space, but you need to be more careful and do not let him catch the handle." Pei Ling lowered her head and said in a low voice, "Thank you, Empress, I understand. Since the prince is already against the little one will not retreat. Next, the little one will secretly collect more evidence. If you can seize the prince's handle, it will be fatal and make him never have a day to turn over." Yulan heard the sound of a smile, and a flash of worry in his eyes, and said lightly, "You are always so stubborn. This palace knows that you are extraordinary, but the prince is not an ordinary person. His methods are far more poisonous than you think. Pei Ling, this palace, I don't want to lose you." Pei Ling was shocked and looked up at Yulan. She saw that her eyes were filled with real emotions. She almost couldn't suppress her desire to respond, but she knew that this emotion was her biggest risk and the biggest danger. She said in a low voice, "Empress, the young man will protect himself and you. Please rest assured that the young man will not be entrusted." Yulan sniffed, reached out and patted her shoulder lightly, with a helpless look in her voice, "I'll believe you once. But remember, no matter when, save your life first. Wait for good news." Pei Ling lowered her head and made up her mind. The breathing space that Yulan had for her was hard-pressed. She must seize the opportunity to further weaken the prince's strength and prepare for the final battle. Her eyes swept over the night outside the hall, and a cold light flashed in her eyes. This palace game, she had no way out and could only move forward. At the same time, in the imperial book room, Chen Zhen sat alone on a dragon chair, playing with a jade pendant in his hand, his face as deep as water. He just received the news that after Yulan met the sacred, the emperor did not pursue her mistakes anymore, which made his anger grow stronger. He said in a low voice, Yulan, you are a good method, but what I hate the most is the Pei Ling beside you. A little palace girl dares to ruin the big things in this palace. This palace must make her pay for it." He stood up, walked to the window, looked into the direction of the far-off palace, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. "Come on, send this palace orders to send dead soldiers to the palace, and get rid of Pei Ling at all costs. In addition, continue to collect the handles of Yulan, and this palace wants them to disappear from this palace in no time." The night was deep, and the undercurrents in the palace were surging. Pei Ling's confrontation with the prince has entered the stage of white heat transformation, and every step is like walking on thin ice. The emotions between Yulan and Pei Ling are getting deeper and deeper in this reign, and are full of dangers. The two of them stood shoulder to shoulder, quietly waiting for the greater storm that was about to arrive. They all knew in their hearts that the game was undecided and life and death were difficult. The night is like water, and the palace in the heavenly imperial palace is silent, and only the occasional sound of the horns breaks this tranquility. Pei Ling stood under the corridor outside the hall, holding a secret letter that had just been passed down from the secret organization in her hand. The letter stated that the Prince Chen Zhen had recently had a secret relationship with several foreign ministers, and the content pointed out that he wanted to lead the border of Torah and create a rebellion to force the palace to usurp the throne. If this certificate can be used properly, it will be enough to fight the prince online and make him never have a day to turn over. There was a cold light flashing in Pei Ling's eyes. She hid the secret letter carefully and looked up into the hall. Yulan was sitting by the couch, her fingers gently swaying a string of jade rosary, her eyebrows slightly frowned, as if she was thinking about something. Since the emperor's suspicion of her last time, although Yulan has calmed down on the surface, she knows in her heart that the retribution of the Prince Chunzhen will only be even more poisonous. Pei Ling, as the most capable person in her body, has long become the other party's headline. Pei Ling, come in. Yulan's voice came from the hall, carrying a faint and exhausted feeling. Pei Ling pushed the door in, lowered her head and said respectfully, Empress, what instructions do you have? Yulan looked up at her, and with a light voice, she stood up and walked up to her, her eyes filled with concern. In the past few days, I always felt unconscious. Although the prince did not make any moves clearly, his eyes were not there. I heard that he had been in contact with people outside the court recently, as if he was planning something big. Have you heard the sound? Pei Ling's heart moved, and without showing any voice on her face, she took out the secret letter from her sleeve, sent it to Yulan, and said in a low voice, Empress, the young man has just received a secret line. The prince has made a big move. The letter states that he intends to lead the border of the Torah to create a rebellious palace. If this matter can be proved, it is enough to bring him down at the end, and the Empress can also be done forever. Yulan received a secret letter and looked at it carefully. Her face changed, her fingers trembled slightly, and there was anger in her voice. What a kindness, I dare to be so rebellious. If this letter is true, it will definitely make the father disappointed with him. However, the way of this letter is unclear. If it is submitted, it may be the prince's bite and it is said that the palace is trapped. Do you have a way to commit this crime? Pei Ling's eyes flashed with a gleam and said in a low voice, Empress, the young man has a plan, but he can just fight the prince's net. We can just pretend to spread the news, claiming that there is something strange around the border, which will lead the prince to take the initiative to contact those leaders. At the same time, the young man will secretly sneak into the prince's mansion to collect the truth about his relationship with the leader. At that time, the letters and people are there, and the prince will not be able to talk to him. The queen only needs to make this matter fatal. Yulan heard the sound of the eyes, and there was a flash of appreciation in his eyes, but he had deep concern. This is wonderful, it is extremely dangerous. The prince's mansion is so strict, and his dead soldiers are everywhere. If you are discovered, you may not escape unscathed. Pei Ling, this palace. I don't want you to take this big disaster again. Pei Ling raised her head and faced Yulan's gaze. Seeing that her eyes were filled with real concern, her heart couldn't help but feel warm. She said softly, Empress, since the young one is trusted by you, you will not be in any way. If the prince is not eliminated, the Empress will never be able to fulfill its mission. Please rest assured that the young one will protect yourself and you. Yulan looked at her, silent for a moment, and finally said lightly, I believe in you, I will remember that if you don't know, save your life first. This palace waits for you to come back safely. In her voice, there was a difficult feeling to cover up, which made Pei Ling feel ill. Pei Ling lowered her head and retreated outside the hall, making up her mind secretly. This battle is of great importance. If the prince can be successfully defeated, it will not only win peace for Yulan, but also allow her to truly stand firm in this palace. More importantly, the family secrets she had hidden for many years would be completely safe due to the fall of the prince. Because of the secret information, the prince held some of the information of her family in his hand. If he was not eliminated, there would be no harm in the future. The next day, Pei Ling arranged personnel and spread news through secret channels, saying that there was something strange around the border, as if she was not in power over the court, and her intention was to rebel. As soon as this news came out, it really attracted a dispute over the Chinese Communist Party of China. After the Prince Chang'an's message, he immediately sent someone to contact the border leader and tried to speed up the implementation of the plan. At the same time, Pei Ling changed into a night clothes and took advantage of the dark moon and entered the prince's mansion. The prince's mansion was in a strict manner, and the patrol teams were shuttled back and forth, with almost no blind spots. Pei Ling was immersed in the darkness through the experience of the darkness, holding her breath and waiting for the time. Finally, a broken hole was revealed during the handover of the team. Her feet were pointed and her body swept across the high wall like a ghost, and penetrated into the mansion. She headed straight to the prince's book room, avoiding the patrol of several waves on the way, and finally came down to the house outside the book room. Through the window, she saw Qingzhen was having a secret discussion with a man in black, with letters and maps piled on the table, which was obviously in the negotiations and rebellion details. Pei Ling felt nervous and quickly took out a small smoke bomb from her waist. She blew it lightly, and the smoke was always filled with excitement. "Who is this person?" Qingzhen shouted angrily and pulled up his sword. He was confused because of the smoke, so he couldn't tell the direction. Pei Ling took advantage of the trouble and climbed into the window, shaped like an electrician, and straightened to the desk. She flipped her wrist and flashed the cold light of the short dagger, forcing the man in black to take off. At the same time, her other hand quickly grabbed a few key letters on the table and stuffed them into the siege. Cheng En saw the situation and roared, "Come on! Catch the assassin!" The guards' voices were inserted into each other, and the swords were rushing out, and the peeling group was surrounded in an instant. A cold light flashed in her eyes, and her body was like a ghost and shuttled through the sword-light shadow. Every strike was accurate and fatal. Her martial arts are far superior to ordinary people. Although these guardians are numerous, they are not her opponent at all. As the sword light passes, blood rises, and the cry is not endless. He had a bad experience in his love, so he pulled the sword and stabbed Pei Ling, and he had a good martial arts. Pei Ling's side flashed, and the short dagger collided with the long sword, sparking 4 times. She snorted coldly, her feet pointed at her feet, and her body rose up in the air. She flipped in a few rounds to avoid Qing'en's attack. At the same time, a hidden weapon shot out and took the other side's shoulder. Qing'en hummed and moved a little. She grabbed the gap for the moment, rushed out of the book room, and rushed out of the mansion. "Chasing! Don't let her run away!" Qingzhen covered his shoulders and roared, his eyes full of resentment. Pei Ling was as shaped like an electric power, avoiding the pursuit of the troops, and several ups and downs left most of the guards. But just as she was about to pull out the high wall, an arrow broke through the air and shot directly into her heart. Her heart tightened, and her body flashed. Arrows rubbed against her sleeves and entered the wall, making a buzzing sound. She looked up and saw Qingzhen standing far away with a bow, her eyes full of killing. "Pei Ling, I knew you were not simple in this palace. Today, I will definitely kill you here." Qingzhen sneered, and several arrows burst into pieces, like meteors, blocking her retreat. Pei Ling bit her teeth tightly, her feet pointed at her feet, and her body rose up in the air, flipping continuously in the air, avoiding the arrows. Her wrist trembled, and several hidden weapons reflected out, directly following Qing'en's key points. Qingzhen was surprised and hurriedly avoided, but he was still hit by a hidden weapon in his arm, and hummed and moved slightly. Pei Ling grabbed the gap at this moment, turned out the high wall, and her figure quickly stopped falling into the night. The sound of killing behind her was unstoppable, but she used the skills of the dark siege and finally left the pursuit and returned to the palace of Fengya. When the fish belly turned white, Pei Ling changed back to the palace girl's dress and returned to Yulan with a letter. She said in a low voice that happened last night one by one and presented the letter. "Empress, these letters point directly to the prince's connection with the border, and the map marks the place where the rebels gather, which is enough to prove his rebellious intention. Next, as long as the empress faces the holy matter and make the matter public, the prince will never turn over." Yulan looked at the letter carefully, and there was a flash of excitement in her eyes, but she was deeply worried. "Pei Ling, you did a good job, but you committed suicide alone last night and almost couldn't come back. This palace. I really don't want you to work so hard for this palace again." In her voice, she was choked with sobs, and her eyes were filled with heartache. Pei Ling lowered her head, her heart warmed up, and she said lightly, Empress, since the young man has chosen to protect you, he will not be able to feel any storm. In the past few years, the young man has long been keen on life on the tip of a knife to survive. The safety of the young man is the only thing he wants. Yulan looked at her, with a flash of water in her eyes, and she held her hand lightly, her words filled with tenderness. Silly girl, what kind of virtue is this palace? Let you fight for the death of this palace? Pei Ling, I have you in my heart. As soon as this happened, both of them were stunned. Yulan seemed to realize that he had made a mistake, so he quickly opened his hands, turned his eyes, and said lightly, "It's over. It's over. This palace will face the sacred thing and report this to the father. You should rest first, and don't get involved in this few days." Pei Ling lowered her head and retreated to the side, making her heart difficult to calm down for a long time. Yulan's words, "You are in your heart," are like a fire, igniting the deepest emotions in her heart. She knew that this taboo was extremely expensive, but she also understood that no matter what, she could not turn back, for the sake of Yulan and for her unfinished mission. On that day, Yulan went to the palace to face the sacred palace, and carried letters and maps to convey the rebellion of the Prince Qingzhen one by one. She said with all the slightest voice, calling herself a precious concubine, and only seeking peace and stability in the palace, she never dared to have any selfishness. These evidences were all for the Holy Lord, hoping that the Holy Lord would clearly observe. The emperor was furious when he read the letter and immediately issued an order to ban Chen Zhenji from the East Palace. At the same time, he sent Dali Temple to investigate the matter and summoned Jiang Jiang to the Beijing for a question. A few days later, the investigation results came out, and the connection between Qingzhen and the border was in reality, and the rebellion plan was like a mountain. The emperor was furious and wiped out the position of Prince Qingzhen, and gave him a commoner, exiled to the border, and was eventually unable to return to the capital. Several court officials who were linked with Cheng'en were also questioned and cried in the court. The Yulan faction took advantage of the rise and its status became more stable. More importantly, during the investigation, the emperor praised Yulan's loyalty and ability, specially praised her for the concubine venerable, and allowed her to participate in some palace affairs, and her power and trust reached an unprecedented level. Pei Ling, as the most capable person in Yulan, was also praised by the emperor and awarded the title of protecting the female official of the palace. From an inconspicuous palace girl to a new honor in the palace. At the same time, Pei Ling finally confirmed the security of the family's secret through the secret organization. It turned out that the information in the hands of Prince Qingzhen had been ruined with his fall, and her family had finally been eliminated from the crisis due to her efforts. She also unexpectedly received a letter from Nejiang, which mentioned that her brother was still alive and his whereabouts were unknown. At least it gave her a lot of hope and gave her more hope for the future. In the palace of Fengya, the night was deep, and Yulan and Pei Ling were alone in the hall, and the atmosphere was warm and calm. Yulan was wearing a simple and elegant palace dress, leaning against the couch, holding a book in her hand, her eyes falling on Pei Ling from time to time, carrying a tenderness. Pei Ling stood aside, lowered her head and sorted out the documents on the desk. Although she was as respectful as ever, her heart was filled with turmoil. Pei Ling, today's father praised your name as protecting the palace female official. Do you know what this means? Yulan opened her voice lightly, with a smile in her language. Pei Ling raised her head and replied lightly, Empress, I understand. This name is not only a favor, but also a responsibility. The young man will work harder to protect the Empress and maintain the peace and stability of this palace. Yulan smiled lightly, put down the book, stood up and walked to her, and looked at her face carefully. Silly girl, you always have a hard mouth and a soft heart. I know that what you did for the palace is beyond what a female official should do. Pei Ling, since the prince has fallen, the palace has a stable position. Can you be willing to stay by the palace and spend this palace with me? Pei Ling was shocked, raised her head and met Yulan. Seeing that her eyes were filled with real emotions and expectations, she almost couldn't help but want to promise. She knew that this taboo was inevitable in the eyes of others, but she also understood that this emotion had long become the most important part of her life. She said in a low voice, Empress, little will. No matter the rain, little will accompany you until the end. Yulan heard this, and a flash of water flashed in her eyes. She smiled lightly, reached out to hold Pei Ling's hand, her words filled with tenderness. Okay, I have recorded it. But, in this palace, the word, love, is the most harmful. Since you and I have chosen this path, we have to bear all the prices. Pei Ling, are you afraid? Pei Ling held her hand back, her eyes calmed down. Empress, the young one is not afraid. Over the years, the young one has long been romance when she is talking about life on the tip of the knife. As long as the young one is here, the young one will have the courage to face everything. Yulan looked at her with emotion and relief in her eyes, and said lightly, with this sentence of you, I feel at ease. Pei Ling, from now on, you and I will be the same. No matter how the palace is in trouble, I will stand shoulder to shoulder with you. The two smiled at each other, held hands together, and their temperatures conveyed unspoken promises. At that moment, all rights and dangers seemed to have turned into clouds, leaving only this taboo, which emitted the warmest light in this cold palace. The night was shining, and the lights in the palace of the geese were swaying, reflecting the figures of the two people intersecting each other. Pei Ling grew from a hidden secret of her identity to the new palace. She used her wisdom and courage to not only protect the secrets of her family, but also gained power and trust for Yulan. Yulan, from a precious concubine who was stabbed in power, became a precious concubine who truly mastered power. Her emotions with Pei Ling also became the deepest luozhen in this reign. There may still be challenges in the future, but they all understand that as long as they are on the side, there will be no waves. The palace's wind will eventually pass, and their stories will leave behind their legends on this land.